Introduce Naomi to you all. Naomi, thanks so much. You're really welcome, and thanks so much for facilitating this session.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and no pressure being recorded at all. But hopefully you all find this informative and useful, and that you all learned something from this session. And thank you so much, Lisa, for organising this these series of events, which hopefully people will find beneficial. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, hopefully. Let's hope the technology doesn't let us down. And I know how to use the technology is the other thing. Beginning, let me see. There we go. Can everyone see that okay? Before I start, sorry. So my name is Naomi. I work for Belfast Islamic Centre. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Ulster. And my focus is on the integration of Muslims in Northern Ireland, you know, as part of a divided society and all the implications. So I'm really focusing on the Muslim community, but I'm hoping here to include a little bit about the wider minority ethnic population of Northern Ireland. So there is a focus on the Muslim population here, just the nature of my research, but I'm trying to make it a little bit wider. There's a lot of history that's not told, and these are just snapshots. So that's why I've called it a snapshot. So it's going to be quite a lot. So hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end to discuss some of the issues, but we'll go through this now and see what we've got and see how you think. So we've got to place Muslims and ethnic minorities beyond Northern Ireland. It has to be seen in the wider context. There's debates on Islam, its place in the West, colonialism, racism, integration debates, Islamophobia and xenophobia. It's also important to note that Northern Ireland is a post-conflict society, and this means there's a politicization of religion. And we're also very heavily influenced by British debates on immigration, multiculturalism, and this really influences the experiences of minority ethnic people in Northern Ireland. And what hopefully you will get from this session, if nothing else, is that we often view ethnic minority communities as new communities. We have to recognise that minority groups have been present in Northern Ireland since its formation, but their historical presence has largely been ignored. Ethnic monitoring wasn't included in the Northern Irish census until 2001, which effectively rendered ethnic minorities invisible. So as I said, this presentation is going to focus on Muslim community or communities, but will also highlight some of the historical diversity in Northern Ireland. It's also important to note that minority communities are diverse. They're constantly evolving. They're affected by immigration, settlement, international and local politics. In Northern Ireland, we're all classed as other, which leads to expectations of ethnic minority communities as a monolith, but reality, the community and individual experience is incredibly diverse. There are different ethnicities, cultures, nationalities, religions, sects within those religions, and different histories, influences, immigration patterns, and socio-economic class and education levels. The story of 20th century economic migration and settlement is central to the history of Muslims, both in Britain and Ireland. But we have to recognise that contact, immigration, emigration, exchange between Muslim countries and Britain and the wider world and Ireland is much older. Now, it doesn't follow a nice rising curve, as you may imagine. And prior to the 20th century, the pattern of Muslim migration did not follow a uniformly rising curve, rather periods of peaks, troughs, and disjunctures, which depended on the position of Britain and Ireland in the world, trade routes, economic conditions, and the circumstances of the individual migrants and societies from which they emigrated. And there's a bit of a pattern that we're maybe sort of going to go through here. So saints, scholars, so we talk about, you know, the very early days in the medieval period. Then we've got merchants and diplomats who came through. Then we have obviously the period, I've just skipped my slides, I've forgotten what the order I had it in. Then we had, you know, the empire, the British Empire, the impact that had. Then we obviously had the wars, and that was a mass population movement. A lot of the both the Allies and the German Allies were from their respective empires. Then post-war, we had a large influx of people from the Commonwealth to come and rebuild Britain. More recently, of course, with the EU, we've had EU migration settlement. And then as we know, the Syrian war, we've had the VPRS scheme, which had a particular impact on Northern Ireland, but many people came outside of that as well. So early days, we'll go back to the very beginning. Well, not the very beginning, near the beginning. There's evidence of people with African, largely North African ancestry in Roman Britain. There are also sporadic records dating from the medieval times of Black and minority ethnic people in Britain. Of course, that back then they wouldn't have been called minority ethnic, but we're using modern terms for this period. Black people are represented in paintings from Henry VIII. And by Elizabethan times, his daughter, there were notable numbers of Black people in Britain, and others, which they generally referred to as Turks, which was a general term that applied to anyone from the Ottoman Empire. And it was so much of an impact in England that Elizabeth I issued a proclamation complaining against them. Censuses from the 1600s talk about Turks following the belief of Muhammad living in England. They were primarily freed slaves and traders. There were also coffee houses from the Arabic and Turkish traditions opened in London in the 1600s. Working as tailors, traders, and notary public. That's what their job descriptions in the census were. One of them was opened in 1652 by Pasca Rosi from the Ottoman Empire, which is now in Turkey. Turkish merchants also opened Turkish baths in London in 1679 with alternate days for men and women. So there's fleeting appearances in the political and cultural narrative of both Britain and Ireland. But there's also very strong political links, which is something a lot of people don't realise. So following the Protestant Reformation, Queen Elizabeth was quite isolated, Catholic Europe, Protestant Britain. So she developed a very close friendship with the Ottoman Sultan, Murad III. And he actually called her Sultana Isabel, which is like an honorific term. And there was a commercial agreement that lasted from 1583 until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. So that was a long-standing agreement with very, very close links. I think we often think of the Ottoman Empire in terms of the First World War, and we forget there were a lot of links and bonds before then. And we've seen that during the Irish famine. I'm not going to touch on that, but a lot of you may know how the Ottoman, during the Ottoman ruler at that time, give aid to the Irish. By 1580, England had a resident ambassador in Istanbul and consuls throughout North Africa and the Middle East, including Aleppo and Syria and Raqqa. There was also the Moroccan ambassador, Aunt Uri, who arrived in London in 1600s and stayed for 6 months to discuss terms of a treaty with Queen Elizabeth on behalf of the Moroccan ruler. He was hoping to form an alliance between the English Protestants and the Moroccan Muslims against Catholic Spain. Queen Elizabeth also had a good friendship with the Shah of Iran. There was a lot of, which was in Persia back then, and they would have had a lot of trade links with Persia as well. And we tend to think of Ireland, as it's a place apart. A lot of these stories, we talk about England, but Ireland is part of the story too. We may not have had Queen Elizabeth there, but we had these links. So in 845 AD, Yahya Hakam al-Bakri was sent by the Umayyad ruler on a diplomatic mission to the Vikings, because remember, Dublin was a really hot spot for the Vikings. Early Arab and Persian cartographers included Britain and Ireland in their maps, including some of the most famous works, The Image of the Earth and Boundaries of the World. A Moorish geographer, Al-Udri, gave an eyewitness account of whaling in the vicinity of Ireland from about 1058. And Al-Idrisi, who was a very famous North African cartographer, he not only visited Jorvik or York, he also wrote very detailed descriptions of both Ireland and Scotland in one of his books. And it's not clear whether he visited, but he talks about the red-haired men who were very strong when the description. And it's possible that he came to Ireland. It's not very clear. Now, one very strong link that we believe that's recorded not only in the fragment, the Annals of Ireland, but also in Moroccan sources. From the other point of view of these Vikings coming and taking people, there's a Viking raid on what is now Morocco in the 860s, which is said to have led to a great host of North African captives, which were then brought to Ireland as slaves. And they reportedly remained a distinct group known as the Black Men for some considerable period of time after their arrival, and eventually they would have just, married into the local population. So some of you may have this in your gene pool. There's also other evidence, our historical evidence of links. And one of the ones you might have heard about quite recently, because it was just found in 2019, was the Irish translation of Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. It was translated into Irish, and it was actually hidden in a book. You can see it there, a picture of it. It was hidden in another book. It had sort of been made into a cover, and they discovered it. And it's known that Celtic physicians from Dalriada in Scotland were known to have travelled, and probably Ireland as well, went to Moorish Spain for training. There's also this little cross here called the Ballycotton cross. It's from the 9th century. It's a Celtic cross, but it has a centre glass jewel, which an inscription in Arabic Kufi script, which actually says Bismillah, in the name of God, and possibly another link between early Islam or early Arabic Christianity and Ireland. Now, again, when we talk about colonialism and slavery, we tend to think of in terms of, the English impact. And Ireland never had large numbers of slaves. That's true, but we do have local reports, local newspapers recording advertisements announcing people advertisements for runaway slaves. Can you find my slave? Don't employ this person, they're my slave, that kind of thing. Sections of the Irish population were involved with the Atlantic slave trade. Irish merchants profited from the trade, mostly indirectly. So we didn't have, slave ships coming through like you see in Bristol, but there was still people profiting off the trade. 107 people living in Ireland were compensated at the time, when they abolished slavery, for the losses they incurred. And as well as the slavery, there was also the colonialism project. Tens of thousands of Irish men, often accompanied by their wives and children, were in India and other parts of the empire as civil servants, and the vast majority were part of the East India Company or the India Office, or they were part of the British Army. So in the mid-1800s, 42% of the British Army was Irish or in private armies. And that kind of feeds into how a lot of people then came to Ireland. Black African people have lived in Ireland in small numbers since the 18th century, particularly concentrated in major cities such as Limerick, Cork and Dublin. Very small numbers, but still there. And British and Irish gentry who had worked abroad, particularly for the East India Company, they then took their servants home when they returned to Britain or Ireland, either on a permanent or temporary basis. Excuse my typos here. Sometimes when you're making up a slide, you realise after, oh, I didn't close my brackets. So apologise anybody who's really pedantic about grammar and punctuation. I have dyslexia. During the 18th century, Black and Asian people were known to have worked as servants, footmen and nannies, which are called ayahs, or maids to wealthy families. And there's some newspaper reports about that. There's some sort of documentary evidence about that. It was considered to be a fashion statement. It indicated that you had a higher social class because you were able to, either you'd been abroad and you'd got wealth from abroad, and it was a status symbol. And sadly, because of their classes, being servants, their names and stories are largely lost to history. There are one or two that crop up, and one of them being George Henry Thompson, some of you might have heard of. He was a Black man who lived among the Protestants of the Shankill in the 1860s, and he was actually involved in a riot with 100 other people, and he was the only one to receive a fine and 2 years imprisonment. They blamed him for inciting it. Some of you might know this building if you've been to Crumlin. This is the Cockle House in Crumlin. It's part of the estate built by the Royley Hayland family in the 18th century. They were the owners of the first industrial flour mills in Northern Ireland. And according to local tradition, this little building was constructed for a favoured Muslim servant facing Mecca to enable him to pray. But again, his name and background are lost to history. Now, there was some links with India, so we can presume that's probably where he came from. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find anything more about him. Another man who had links with the army was Sheikh Din Muhammad, who was born in 1749 in Patna in Bengal. He joined the British Army at the age of 10, different times indeed, and he moved to Cork in 1784 with his Irish captain. He married a local woman and had a family, and he actually produced a book called The Travels of Din Muhammad, covering his life in India, his experiences in the army. And to be honest, he largely left out his experiences in Ireland because it wasn't fashionable. He'd gone to England, and it wasn't particularly fashionable to have lived in Ireland. So when he moved to England, he set up one of the first Indian restaurants in London called the Hindustani, and then Indian Baths in Brighton in 1814, which of course was a very fashionable hotspot at the time. Mir Aulad Ali moved to Ireland via London to Trinity College in 1861 as a professor of Arabic, Hindustani and Persian. And he was actually one of the founder members of the Preservation of the Irish Language Society. He was very passionate about language and the preservation of Indigenous languages. But he also retained a very strong connection to his heritage and faith. He also married a local woman and continued to live in Ireland until his death, and he's buried in Dublin. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the ways in which people moved through the world before we had all our package holidays, which have all been destroyed from COVID, was as sailors. And from the 16th century, there were a considerable number of non-European sailors from Asia, North Africa and Yemen employed on European ships. They were known as lascars. Some were also known as coolies. So that was lascars were largely associated with India, coolies were associated with China, but really they became a catch-all term for everyone. And they travelled across the world with the British merchant fleet, which couldn't have functioned without them. Their numbers increased year on year. So by 1855, there were as many as 12,000 arriving in British and Irish ports on an annual basis. By 1914, lascars made up 17.5%, or nearly 1 in 6 seamen in the British Merchant Navy. And during World War II, 25% of the British Merchant Navy came from India and East Asia, and a further 5% from the Caribbean, Middle East and Africa. And some of these are recorded as landing in Belfast during World War II. It seems to be largely supply ships who were sunk, and then they were rescued at sea. The description is rescued at sea, and they were brought to Belfast in the 1940s. Conditions were really harsh for these guys. They faced overt discrimination. They had different pay scales than the British white people. They had different specifications for cabin size, for bed size, for food. So they were really very much second class. So over the years, many jumped ship, were abandoned by their employers, or were unable to sail because of lascar quotas. Many died at sea, and others were left destitute at ports. And there's one report I found back from 1885 in the Belfast newsletter, and it was quite grim. It reported a court dispute between the shipbuilders who had brought them there and 3 Muslim seamen who were living destitute in a workhouse. And actually, it was 2 sort of older men and a younger one, and it mentioned the younger one was actually living in the street. And unfortunately, that report said that the local court wasn't able to help them. It was a matter for, maritime law, and so their fate's unknown. It's not clear what happened to them. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any further information on that. Some of the lascars married and started families with English and Irish women. And in fact, Yemeni, Indian and Somali lascars settled in port cities, and they laid the foundations of some of the oldest continuous Muslim communities in the UK and Ireland. Now, from my own research, there's again a lot more probably than what I was able to uncover. There are at least 10 lascars buried in Belfast City Cemetery in unmarked graves, most of them. I went around, I couldn't see any of them with headstones. And that's their names: Najm Ahmed, Faiz Hamid Muhammad, Fatch Muhammad, Busley Ali, Konji Muddin, Kangali Mahari, Valadik Khan, NK Kamar, Muhammad Esak and Basso Khan. And it's kind of sad, they're buried far away from home in unmarked graves. And I went to go and try and find the graves, and unfortunately I couldn't see any memorial to them. At the time, it was quite a dramatic thing. This is one of them, Konji Muddin. His death, he died actually at sea and was buried in Belfast, and you can see he had a big procession through Belfast and created a bit of a stir. There was 100 followers of the Prophet Muhammad, as the paper puts it here, and you know, it hit the papers. It hit the Belfast Telegraph at the time. Now, I've mainly talked about men here, and the role of women throughout history has often been overlooked, and this is particularly true of migrant and ethnic minority women. Until relatively recently, research focused primarily on male migrant workers, and it perhaps gave the impression that almost all early migrants were male. The historic near invisibility of women as migrants is in part due to their presumed lack of agency in the migration process and their assumed place in the home. But Black and minority ethnic women appear either as references or passing comments within the historical archives, and often because of scandal, because they were working in professions that were seen as immoral at the time. But it's estimated that in 18th century England, there were at least 5,000 Black women. The numbers in Ireland are unknown. And these women were expecting, as some of the ones in England there on the side there, they were expected very much to assimilate into British society and follow those cultural norms that were conflated with traditions of Christianity, gentility and status, and very much, and a lot of them would have changed their native names to British names, and obviously wore, you know, the stays and the corsets of the day. Now this lady, Rachel Baptiste, she was from Ireland. She was born sometime in Ireland in the middle of the second quarter of the 18th century, and she was a singer. She sung popular Irish and Scottish airs, and she first appeared on stage in Dublin in 1750 in a benefit concert, and she regularly performed in Dublin. And then she moved up to Belfast, and she had her first concert that we know of in 1772, and she started an expansive set of events in the assembly rooms, and then also in Carrickfergus, Downpatrick and Lisburn, and her final concert was in 1773 in Belfast. So she's buried somewhere in Belfast. Another lady, Nazir Begum, again we're going back to that colonial times in India. She was the daughter of Aziz Jahan of Kashmir, and she married Colonel Thomas Alexander Cobb in India before returning with him to Ireland in 1828. And they actually, his family owned Newbridge House in County Dublin, and the little Indian and Mughal paintings and miniatures that they had amassed in India, they put them on display in Newbridge House Museum. So that's, you know, we're talking sort of isolated individuals, really not community as such. We're really talking about, you know, notable individuals and isolated incidents. But really from the 20th century, that's when we start to see, you know, developed communities being established. Although we have to also recognise that the Irish traveller community has been distinct from the settled Irish community for at least 1,000 years. And we have to acknowledge that they are also part of the minority traditions in Northern Ireland. There's also a significant Jewish community established by Eastern European and European migrants primarily in the 1870s, although we also have to note that there are earlier records of Irish Jews. Indian and Pakistani immigrants really started to come from the 1920s and 30s, and many of those settled, not in Belfast as you would expect, but Cookstown and Dungannon. Arab doctors and students were in the Northern Ireland from the 1930s, but there are earlier records. There's records of doctors down in Dublin coming in the 1900s for training in Trinity and things like that. People of Chinese origin arrived really from the 1960s in significant numbers, and they were the largest non-EU community in Northern Ireland for many years. They were involved in the catering trade, and we'll get to why a bit later on. The first Chinese restaurant in Belfast was opened in 1962. It was called the Peacock, and it was rapidly followed by others in smaller towns around Belfast. Now, the Southeast Asian settlers who arrived in the 1920s were largely involved in the sale of those who hadn't come on a specific profession. They were involved in the door-to-door sale of goods, especially clothing. They had good links to be able to bring the product in from Asia. And the first Indian high street retailer opened in Derry in 1943, which is called the Corner Boot Stores by the Chadha brothers, and there were many similar shops. And there's still some shops in Belfast today owned by some of these established families. You might not know it, but there's still some of these families still own businesses and textile businesses in throughout Northern Ireland. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Nizam Din opened the first Asian-owned factory in Northern Ireland in the Old Park area of Belfast. And in the 1960s, it had as many as 70 to 80 employees. His brother also opened a knitwear factory. There was also Ghulam Muhammad Boss, who became president of the first Pakistani society in Belfast. And also these guys were really important in the foundation of Belfast Islamic Centre. And he employed 15 people in the 1960s. Shah Deen, who arrived in 1956, opened a large clothing warehouse in Donegal Street in Belfast city centre in the 1960s. And these guys are really the elders in many ways of many of the earliest Muslim communities, and their children, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren live in Northern Ireland to this day. International students have travelled to Britain and Ireland for decades. There are records of international student doctors in Dublin from the 1900s, as I mentioned, and also Scotland and England from the 1800s. The first known international students in Queen's University arrived in the 1940s, but there were significant numbers coming from all over the world in the 1960s. And there's some images there of students from meeting the bishop there from Queen's, and the Ugandan students there from Stranmillis who came over to teach. And it, again, caused a bit of a stir in the media. There's records of interfaith service in Rosemary Street Presbyterian in the 1940s, where they had a UN day and Syrian students were reading sections from the Quran, and different students from all over the world were taking part. As well as obviously students and business people, since the 1930s, successive governments recruited doctors, nurses and other health workers from overseas to work in the UK health services. So the first mass recruitment was really the African Caribbean nurses in the 1950s, but also Arab and Asian doctors from the 1960s. And the NHS still really heavily relies on overseas recruitment, so as high as 30% of medical professionals come from or were born outside the UK. And of course there are second, third, fourth generations also within the NHS as well. And some of the notable people that I'm just highlighting here is Dr. Mansur Khan, who sadly passed away in 2016. He was a notable cardiologist. He came in the 1970s. And in the centre of the other photo there is Professor Harith Lamke, a former trustee at BAC. He was also a leading obstetrician. He taught my father in Queen's in the 1970s. He also was a mentor for Professor Dornan, who recently passed away. And he, if you read the reports, he also talks about Professor Harith was one of his mentors. Again, another story that I certainly didn't hear so much about. Maybe you guys have heard more about this. So we know, of course, that GIs were placed in Northern Ireland during the war, and there was 120,000 of them, but there was also a unit of African American troops based in Northern Ireland because of the politics in America. Obviously, they were very they enforced segregation even on their soldiers, so they had entire units just comprised of Black soldiers, and they were placed in Dunmurry, Antrim, Spring Hill, Moneymore, and there was also, Asian soldiers recorded. My slides got off there, landing in Belfast during the war as well. And so we've talked about students, we've talked about doctors, and we've talked about soldiers. And one thing that maybe people haven't considered is mother and baby homes. Because back then, obviously, women who had children out of wedlock or had relationships with people were put in these mother and baby homes, and some of them were mixed race children. And the report, now it hasn't really been covered so much up here, but the Southern report found that there is systematic discrimination against women and children of mixed race families. Children were stripped of their identity, culture, and in significant cases, even of their ethnicity and language. The family sort of destroyed the records based on their status at birth. Mothers who are members of the mixed race community report on how they were racially profiled and their children were eugenically rated for intelligence based on the nun's assessment of the intelligence of the natural mother and how negroid the features of the infant were. This just blows my mind as a mother of mixed race children. When it comes to the child's records, religious orders did not record the ethnicity of a child's parents, and the default description, African, was mainly used. The names of their fathers were routinely ignored. The African fathers were often professional men, doctors, engineers, and journalists, but it was deliberately hidden from the children. Their identity was removed, but at the same time, their claim to an Irish identity was also refused, which was catastrophic for the Irish mixed race community. Some of them were never even told that they had a mixed race mother or a black mother or a black father if they were passing. And this is a side of the mother and baby homes that hasn't really been touched on, but it's heartbreaking when you read some of the testimonies of these. And of course, I'm jumping around here, but I hope you can still follow me. Another thing that we often talk about, the troubles we think in terms of orange and green, and we don't consider how it impacted on ethnic minority communities. And if any of you had joined our Tuesday Challenge events, you might have heard some of our older women describe how the troubles impacted them in terms of their businesses being attacked and things like that. But there were also victims of the troubles who died during the Troubles. So Nick Ray, Patrick Yeo identified over 30 Troubles victims from ethnic, minority and traveller backgrounds. Some of those were army who had come over, but these are just 4 of them. Asha Chopra was caught in crossfire while sitting in a car in Derry, Londonderry. She was only 25 and she was pregnant. Her 2 young children were with her at the time. That was 1974. Nurbaz Khan, a member of the Muslim community, was killed in a targeted shooting. His brother survived, and that was in 1973. He worked with the army, so he was targeted for that. Muhammad Abdulkhalid was only 18 years old when he was shot over 30 times in 1974. And again, his family, he'd come as a 12-year-old to Northern Ireland. His father was a civilian who worked with the army. And quite a lot of the Pakistani community did come here as a civilian support for the army and have stayed on. Max Orlunda was a 35-year-old Belfast-based accountant who was killed in the Dunmurry train bombing. The first African civilian and only Nigerian to have been killed in the Troubles. So, and I'm going to sort of talk quickly here about the Muslim community and the establishment of it as a community. So we know from the 1930s that they started to organise in terms of praying together, communal prayers, and in the 1930s we got our first Islamic cemetery in Carnmoney, and began to organise funerals and services. We had our first Eids in the 1950s that we know of, and in 1978 the Belfast Islamic Centre was formed. And it was really an amalgamation, a joint effort between Queen's University students, Muslim businessmen and doctors who had already settled in Northern Ireland. And it's missed in this whole kind of, Protestant, Catholic, and, the census had 4 different types of Christianity, but Islam is actually Northern Ireland's second largest religion. Hasn't come without controversy. There's always been, they've got a report here from the 1970s, others from the 2001, and an attack on the horrific attacks that were carried out in 2003 on the Muslim community in Craigavon. That fear of the Muslims coming and taking over, unfortunately, is very real for some time. The community today, there are at least 48 different nationalities. It's incredibly diverse. We don't know how many there are. The last census, there were 4,000. Estimates now are anything up to 10,000 from various different groups, various different ethnicities, socioeconomic groups. And of course, the biggest impact on the community has been the arrival of the Syrian refugees in the VPRS scheme. So if you think back in 2011, we had 4,000 recorded Muslims, and just in the past 5 years, we've had 2,000 largely Muslim Syrians who have arrived. that's been a massive increase on what has been, quite an established community. Undoubtedly, the numbers of Black and minority ethnic people has increased with the arrival of these new immigrant communities since the ceasefires. There are many estimates, as I said, we estimate around 10,000, but the 2021 census will give a better indication of current numbers. Just to give an indication, so in the 1970s, we had Belfast Islamic Centre in Craigavon. There are now 10 Islamic centres across Northern Ireland, very small, but it's an indication of how much the Muslim community has grown. And of course, other communities have grown as well. It's important to acknowledge the historical presence of different ethnic and religious groups in Northern Ireland who have been present in Northern Ireland for many decades, even before the formation of Northern Ireland itself. We have seen major changes in demographics in recent years, but these stories are a part of the Northern Irish history, not apart from it. And although recorded history has focused on male migrants and minorities, it's also important not to stereotype minority women. We're not mainly migrants, passive followers of their husbands or families. And a focus of statistics only sees them in the context of visa categories or ethnic groupings, ignoring the story, skills and education they bring to the table and their contributions to life in Northern Ireland. And that's something in later sessions we're going to explore a little bit more about, that cultural and religious life in later sessions. And I'm just going to finish up with something. So we've sort of covered a couple of the stories, but nothing happens in a vacuum. And I think it's important to understand immigration in the context of legislation and policy. And I'm just going to go through 3 wee slides, and then we're going to have hopefully a little bit of time for discussion afterwards. So the Aliens Act in 1905, because of that, you can see there's a sign. People were beginning to get sort of that moral panic about immigration. And so they introduced the Aliens Act to introduce immigration controls and register aliens, as they called them, for the first time. They said it was designed to prevent paupers or criminals from entering the country, but in reality, one of its main objectives was to control Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe because of the pogroms that they were having, and obviously the rise of Hitler and things like that. That started a long time before Hitler, and those kind of anti-Jewish sentiments. In 1914, the British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act was introduced. Now, as I said, British women have been marrying Lascars and other immigrant men since at least the 1600s. But again, there was this moral panic about these marriages. And this act didn't only just apply to these aliens, in other words, foreign-born residents, who then had to carry an alien registration card, but British women who married these men automatically lost their British nationality, and so did their children. And this wasn't revoked in 1942. So, and then other policies came in which made life even harder. So we had the Coloured Alien Seamen Order Act in 1925. Initially, it was only for those port cities. As I said, those were the earliest Muslim communities really were born around those port cities. And again, causing the panic. So they introduced this act to try and limit their immigration to Britain. And unfortunately, one of the side effects of that was, even if they had Black and Asian, these Black and Asian people had British nationality, if they were unable to prove their status, then they were threatened with deportation or denied employment. And that obviously had impact onto their families, who were thrown into severe poverty. So the poor economic circumstances of these minority and mixed race families, and the consequently, the difficult circumstances they find themselves in, would feed into the condemnation and stereotyping about mixed race and minority ethnic people that became rampant during the 1930s, and also set the groundwork for, generational poverty that has continued. And that impact of that policy is still, extant to this day. Another sort of notable act was the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Chinese community largely came in the catering trade, and they remained in that trade, and that was largely because of this act. Because of the number of Commonwealth citizens coming over, the UK wanted to stop that. So they prevented any immigrant who did not hold a British passport or have a firm connection to the UK by birth or descent, and they subjected them to various restrictions. And this limited further immigration into the UK to those with certain professions and those with jobs already secured. So then it became a chain migration. So if you already had a business that was, a catering business, then you could maybe bring relatives or family over to work in that business only. And that kind of, again, perpetuated that career path, because it was the only way that people could come over. And a little bit more up to date, the hostile environment policy. This is something that still impacts people today. It was a set of administrative and legislative measures to make life in the UK as difficult as possible for people without leave to remain, and hope that they would voluntarily leave. It was first introduced in 2012 by Theresa May. It's been widely criticised as being inhumane, ineffective and unlawful. The Human Rights Council has stated that it fosters xenophobia within the UK, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission found that the policy broke equalities law, but it's still continued. And we've actually recently had Priti Patel announce some new reforms that's going to make the system even harder for many. It's not going to recognise people who've come through illegal routes, and it's only going to recognise people who've come through the legal routes, such as the resettlement scheme, which is kind of now we've got a two-tier. We've already had a bit of a two-tier system, but now we're having this system where they've got the deserving and the undeserving refugee. And it's important to understand the way the person reaches the UK is not related to whether they're in need of protection. Not everybody is able to access a safe and regular scheme. And this narrative, this sort of anti-immigrant narrative, has also fed, it's not new, but it's also fed into hate crime and attacks on ethnic minority people. Back in 1965, the UK introduced legislation to address this, outlawing discrimination on the grounds of colour, race or ethnic or national origins, but that only applied to Great Britain, did not apply to Northern Ireland. They did bring in the Incitement to Hatred Act in 1970 and the Public Order Act in 1987, but in reality, up until 1997, when they implemented the Race Relations Order Act and then later on the Northern Ireland Act and Section 75 in 1998, it was perfectly legal in Northern Ireland to discriminate on the basis of race. And so this legislation was 32 years after the implementation of similar legislation in the UK. Northern Ireland politicians did not want race legislation's extent to Northern Ireland because they're afraid of upsetting the sectarian balance. They claimed that minority ethnic communities were simply too small to merit legal protections. And in 1965, when they introduced the law in England, the Northern Irish Home Secretary proclaimed that in Ulster, racial discrimination does not, in fact, exist. Which unfortunately is not true. And we have multiple, I just clicked through there accidentally, but we have multiple evidence that the ethnic minorities were subject to discrimination. And effectively what we did and what we have done, and sometimes still reflected in how we talk about legislation, was that it was the presence of ethnic minorities that caused racism rather than the discrimination itself. And, since 2015, racial hate crimes have exceeded those of sectarian hate crime in Northern Ireland. And when you think the impact on such a small percentage is huge. So instead of thinking about how big is that population, we'd be thinking, what is the impact on those individuals, on those citizens of our country? And although we got that legislation back in 1997, we're still behind the UK. They have since moved on, they have since progressed, and we haven't. In 2016, the ECRI highlighted a number of key areas where individuals in Northern Ireland have a lower level of protection against racial discrimination than people in other parts of the United Kingdom. Judge Marinan's review on hate crime in 2020 highlighted the lack of meaningful prosecutions and the need to introduce racially aggravated crime as currently in England and Wales, and significant reform of the incitement of hatred laws. And again, these aren't new recommendations. They were highlighted by NICEM in 2013 and by a report in the Criminal Justice Inspectorate in 2017. In 2018, the Northern Ireland Policing Board highlighted the phenomenon of paramilitary groups targeting ethnic minority communities. Been evidence, but no strategy appears to be developed to tackle it. And of course, over the summer, we saw the Policing Board report and the Ombudsman report highlight the disparity in policing, and it's very topical today, between the Black Lives Matter protests and the statues protests, where Jada Franson, a known far-right individual with convictions for hate speech in Belfast, was allowed to walk with impunity and without prosecution, and those who organised a peaceful, socially distanced protest have been referred to the PPS. Just at the bottom there, there's a couple of pictures. The one before, the pictures were from Newtonards Dungannon and Invery Community Centre in Belfast. So again, areas where there's small numbers of Muslims, but yet, you know, it sort of shows that it's not numbers that are the problem, it's the racism. At the bottom here, we've got Britain First protesting outside BIC, protesting outside our new building, which we're renovating. This is the BMCA building, which was set on fire in January, and these are leaflets that were given out 2 or 3 years ago to homes in Belfast. So I hope I've taken a bit of a roller coaster there. I hope you're able to follow. So we've talked about, you know, the history, and we've talked a little bit about the policy and the legislation that have affected how communities are received and how they're treated in Northern Ireland. So now I want to open up a little bit. I want to talk about the language that we use and consider, maybe have a wee bit of a discussion around this. You know, how can we recognise minority ethnic, minority religious people in our concept when we conceptualise Northern Ireland? How do we recognise it's not orange and green, including in the historical narratives as well as the present day? And there's some I say pet peeves of mine that I often hear used, and I'm just going to sort of go through my pet peeves and maybe we can discuss this. So the BME community, and I know the term BME or BM is controversial, but this also concept that there's a single minority community. There's not. The Muslim community is small and relatively unified despite its differences, but it's still not a monolith. And, you know, minority ethnic groups in Northern Ireland are quite connected. We're quite good relations, but there's still intergroup differences. And that's why we sort of come into tokenism. You know, one person cannot represent the needs of all these diverse groups. So we need to recognize the diversity. Instead of saying BME community, recognize that there are minority ethnic communities. And another one that really gets my goat is the newcomer community or newcomer communities, because it ignores the existing communities who've been here for generations and into which newcomer individuals integrate. So maybe consider using terms like newcomer individuals, but also we need to think, when does someone stop being a newcomer? Often we also hear terms like guest. You know, why are we not talking about citizens, member of the community? Just because someone is an ethnic minority, they're not guests in Northern Ireland. And of course, my biggest bugbear, the two communities and the use of the other. So it's the two communities and other. But this binary orange and green excludes all people in Northern Ireland who do not fit in these boxes. It ignores the diversity that exists in Northern Ireland and discounts part of the community as other or not really belonging. And that's why we get fourth and fifth generations here who still get asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? And I'm going to open it up now if people want to maybe comment on anything. We have just over 20 minutes. If anybody would like to talk on any of the things I've spoke about today, or is everybody so quiet?
Naomi, do you want to stop sharing screen so we can see everyone, maybe?
Yes, good idea. Yeah.
Okay. So we've had some good comments and discussion in the chat as well. So yeah.
I haven't been following the chat because I was just doing my presentation. So I'm going to go and have a wee look through things here as well. So if anybody wants to speak, please do. See.
Liz?
Naomi, thank you so much for that. Really so informative, and you know, there was a lot, you know, so much, you know, just really interesting, you know, observations that you made throughout. And I was just wondering, what are you going to do with this? Is this going to be published in some way? And, you know, how is it going to be, you know, how is this information going to be disseminated?
I was just telling, so basically what happened, I'm doing a PhD in the University of Ulster, and it's about the current situation in Northern Ireland. But my supervisor sent me off, and I go down rabbit holes. So they sent me off and said, you know, we'll do a wee chapter on history of Muslims in Northern Ireland, and a chapter is meant to be about 10,000 words, and I've written 100,000 words. So it's like most of this is not going to be in my thesis, but I would love to publish some of this and have this in the personally. If anyone has any way of doing this, I would really love to work with someone to get, or Lisa, you know, let's do this, because I would love this information to be more widely available, and I'm very open to that. Absolutely.
Another task for you, Lisa.
Add it to the list, no bother. Listen, I
wave
agree.
your magic wand.
I agree, it's amazing. I was just saying that to Naomi beforehand, you know, this needs to be out in public, and I was saying, write a book. I think Anne had her hand up, and then Cara next.
Yeah. Okay, Naomi, that was absolutely fascinating. What a wide-ranging talk, and particularly thinking back to what you call kind of catch-all terms like Turks and Mohammedans, which you know, was used so widely, and reference to people like Chadha, who I remember. I mean, I know quite a few of them. That was fascinating, and I think yes, it needs a much wider audience. I think a television program, you know, a book would only reach a few people, but something like a television program would, because there's so much information. It is so fascinating, and you've got wonderful photographs. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
This is only a section. I mean, I could have gone on. I was sort of making this presentation, but I need to stop at some point because I wanted to have a bit of time to discuss things as well. So,
no, it's wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Cara?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Naomi. Thanks for the invitation as well to come along, because it's been a great opportunity, and I'm delighted to be here. I know I was about 10 minutes late. I'm a counsellor, but I'm also our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at the University, Naomi, and I haven't met you before. So funny, today's Transgender Day of Visibility, so I was trying to get something out in our internal communications. That's why I was late to join. But I'm not sure if you're, I know I'm going to say it, the BEAM network, but I'm not sure if you're a member of the network within the university, but if not, or even whatever, it would be fantastic. We do like a diversity hour series in the university, usually on a Thursday on a different theme. It would be fantastic if you were able to come to present to staff. And
pressure, like my supervisors are there, like
yeah. Well, I would be delighted, and more increasingly expanding that net to have PhD researchers presenting as much as staff presenting on particular topics and subjects. But and even within council, I'm not sure if there are other councillors here, but it would be maybe even a focused target session would do absolutely no harm in Causeway, Coast and Glens anyway, never mind other councils. But this has been so informative, and just thanks so much, and I'm really appreciative, and hopefully I could maybe tie in with you after today. But thanks.
I'd love to do that. Yeah, definitely. So I'm just going down the comments here as well. Sorry, I've just missed the one I was going to talk on there. Bring it to a wider audience. I'm all for that. Let me see. I completely lost where I was going to talk. About how the different communities have enhanced society. Well, I suppose I didn't go too much into it, but in terms of, they were doctors, they were academics, they were, you know, business people, and that in itself helped build Northern Ireland. You know, there were doctors, as I said, like Dr. Harris Lamke, he taught my father, he also taught my brother in Queen's, and they were medical students, and they've taught, you know, the likes of Professor Dornan, who's made the headlines, passed away this last week. So you know, that is the impact. You know, they're part of the society. You know, they're just they have built Northern Ireland alongside everybody else. and Turkish baths in 1600s available to men and women. It's very traditional having the men and women days. That would have been standards like across the Middle East and Turkey. So yes, it maybe was new for Britain, but it would have been a standard policy in hammams throughout Ottoman Empire. So that was, yeah, forward thinking for here maybe, but definitely standard. So so yes, Cara, I'd love to join you and anybody else. I love to get this out here. I love people to hear these stories and perhaps expand on them. You know, I'm one person and maybe there's other people out there who could help me. Let's go find those. I mean, I know I have the grave numbers, but you know, I would love, you know, to acknowledge like those the Lascars who died in Belfast. I just find that the whole story is incredibly sad. Like I spent one day, I was freezing, wandering around city cemetery, like trying to find these grave numbers and hoping I would find like some marker or something for these men. And some of them in the pauper's grave, but some of them are actually in plots. And there was nothing, and it just broke I just felt so sad. Some of them are like just very young men away from home, and so like little things like that. I would love to see Northern Ireland acknowledge its history. And I know history is so contested in Northern Ireland, but we have these little snippets of things that we could mark that are not orange and green. And I would love to see that in Northern Ireland. I would love to see that history not just acknowledged in books and TV, but actually, you know, have something at City Cemetery when we have the Jewish cemetery there, of course, but acknowledge that there are, you know, these other histories as well, in relatively recent times, you know, acknowledge like the presence of not only the GIs, but the fact that there were African American groups who were segregated and were victims of racism from their own government, and then they came here and were, you know, part of the story of Northern Ireland, and in some cases left children in the mother and baby homes and things like that. So we I would love that all to be expanded. No pressure, Nick. So I know you're from the museum service. I actually used to work in the Ulster Museum many years ago, but it was a natural history section. I'm not actually a historian at all. I'm complete what's the word, imposter. This is just pure out of interest that I do this. Anyone else want to say anything?
Maybe could we bring in Nick? I've been chatting to Nick and chatting Nick's ear off as well about expanding the stories and more inclusive stories and more history, and really talking about coming together to do a symposium to gather these stories together, Naomi, as well. So maybe bring Nick in just to have a chat as well about what he thought.
I thought that is going to be a really hard act to follow. That's how I feel about all this. Just a little bit intimidating.
Well, you were meant to go first initially, so I was worried about following you. So I'm glad I've gone first.
Because of our scheduling, unfortunately, I had to be pushed to the back. My talk, when it comes, is going to be so much more informal and just about personal experiences working in Syria. But the content of yours was, I mean, it was fabulous to listen to, but really eye-opening as well. Really valuable research, I think, that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a wee comment there in the chat, just Naomi saying right at the beginning of the presentation that you stated that ethnic monitoring wasn't included in the census until 2001, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think it all comes down to, and even like when you look at the census this year, it's been, you know, what is your religion? Your religion is, you know, are you Presbyterian, Methodist, Church of Ireland, or Catholic, or an other? Because there's just that we still think very much in terms of the two communities. And you know, and again, it's recognizing that communities are here. They may be small in comparison to the other communities, but they're still, but I think that just it wasn't of interest until 2001, because the focus has always been on which is the bigger community. Is it the Protestants? Is it the Catholics, the Nationalists? You know, and that debate has overshadowed everything else. And it, you know, it's trying to work out how to screen share again. And this is just my final slide here. That I was just going to sort of go over as well. You know, we talk a lot about integration when it comes to migrants and immigrants and minority communities, as if it's only the onus is on the individual. And of course, every individual has a responsibility to be a responsible citizen. But belonging and acceptance goes beyond just providing a place to stay. So we have hate crime and racism. It creates this sense of isolation. It creates this alienation, the sense that you don't really belong. And so our weak legislation has resulted, there's been very, very few prosecutions for hate crime. And there's not that feeling of safety and belonging. But there's also been these structural barriers, and one of them is that the fact that they weren't even recognised in the census up until very recently. So we can't go back and say, we can go back and look and see that there were, so many Mohammedans and so many Hindus and so many Sikhs, and there were these numbers from the 1920s onwards. You see that coming through the census, but these structural barriers will affect, and it's going to have an impact going on. I mentioned the asylum seeking process. So we've got young children in our schools in Northern Ireland today who have grown up in Northern Ireland. They have the accent, they have the culture, they understand, Northern Irish society, but they hit 18 and their family still hasn't got status. They're unable to go to work. They're unable to go into full-time education with their peers. And you've got that isolation. And we've seen with COVID, there's been an increased impact on, migrants who are here, who don't have, if you're not an EU citizen, you don't have that safety net of benefits or job security. So, these sort of structural issues can also impact how, minority communities feel or belong, or individuals, because not everybody is a community. And these sort of anti-immigration sentiments that we hear, even from the Home Secretary herself, can impact all immigrants and ethnic minorities, because if you're told you're not valuable, and whenever we spoke to I've just forgotten her name, the people who do the census, we it was always like, well, you're not statistically significant, and it kind of makes you feel, well, you don't matter because you're too small. And it's kind of like, yeah, we don't matter because we're not part of the majority communities. And I think that has been an attitude that has Nisra, sorry, no offense to Nisra, but they do, that's the way they do things. Everything is by stats. It's all very, they're statisticians. That's, it's not statistically significant, but from a cultural, perspective, it can be quite painful to sort of feel that you don't really belong. And that's, and that really does, yeah. But then to the 1997, you could still tell someone they couldn't have the house because they were Black. No, you can't have that. You're Asian. So that's not that long ago either, which is also quite shocking. So we still have time. I was hoping that people would want to talk a bit more. It's like I've done enough talking. My throat's getting sore now.
Naomi, can we go back a wee bit, because you shared a slide there at the end and invited people to talk a wee bit about the language used and the terms used. So I'm wondering if we can invite a bit of a conversation around that, because I know that a lot of organisations that would be present today as well would have that language or would use that language, and also really talking about something that Camilla raised in the chat around scrutiny of policies and procedures and how we implement things. I see Camilla's got her hand up.
She's got her hand up. Let her speak. Better let the lady speak.
We'll bring Camilla in, sure.
Yeah.
I think even the fact that there's been a report this week looking at not using the term BAME, it baffles me that we needed something like that when there was actual people from the ethnic minority community saying that this is not how we identify ourselves. So again, we go into these things not listening to actual people on the ground, and we need reports on reports saying these things. I just don't understand why we constantly need that. Even in setting up a network within work, we took about 3 hours deciding what we were going to name it, because people didn't understand why it shouldn't be named that way, why people shouldn't be put in boxes. And whenever I talked about the scrutiny and accountability, for me, the fact that Naomi was able to go back so far back, and when I look at the word alien being used, we're not doing much different now. We're still using the word the other. The othering still exists. So in essentially, what is being done in terms of scrutiny and accountability, and what needs to be done? Because while I've said this so many times, these are people's 95. These are, Naomi said this as well before in one of her talks, that these are people's 95. This is what they do, but this is people's realities. Who is holding them accountable for and being scrutinized. We have the racial equality subgroup, which I know Naomi sits on as well. But it's not even the fact that they are not being effective, but they are not being allowed to do a lot more than they should be doing. Who essentially is actually working for the community, for the ethnic minority communities? Who is actually truly representing the voice of these communities?
I think that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And I think a big thing is really not speaking on behalf of others. And I think, I am a member of the Muslim community. I work for Belfast Islamic Centre, but I can't speak on behalf of 10,000 Muslims in Northern Ireland. I do my best to raise awareness about Islam. In another session, we're going to talk about the Islamic religion, and then we're going to go into culture. But I, can't speak on behalf of the entire Muslim community, and there's nobody who can really speak on behalf of any. Nobody can speak on behalf of all the communities. But I think it's important that we are listening to the voices that, if you're in a decision-making space, and it's particularly dealing with ethnic minority communities, or if it's dealing with a cultural issue, and you look around the table and that table is all one color and one background, that or one of the two backgrounds, and you haven't got a diversity at the table, I think you need to reconsider your recruitment processes, or consider, how can you get the voices at the table. If you work with ethnic minorities, is there ethnic minorities? Is that target group that you're working with? Are they at the decision-making table? Are they just, in the, at the bottom, being helped? Because the reality is there are very well-established communities here. There are very well, established individuals here, very capable individuals who could be in those roles. And it's really about diversifying that, just looking out and saying, like, we need to get more diversity in here, and not just like a tokenism, but like genuinely getting people engaging with the process. I think is so important, and giving them the confidence to say, you can do this, because sometimes that's all it takes. People have said to me, it's really hard to get people on board, and it's like, well, you tell people they can do it, they will do it. A lot of the time it's a lack of confidence, and just because they don't know the lingo, so you train them on the lingo. They don't know how to do an interview process, so you coach them on how, the civil service, or how your organization, what language needs to be used to get that job, because they don't have maybe somebody who has that, I know, like a lot of these job things, it's a certain lingo, that you need to provide. You need to so if you have someone who could do the job, but they just don't have the lingo, they're not going to get that job. So it's about, mentoring people and making sure that they have those skills so that they can use their natural abilities to the best, and to benefit everyone. I think that's really, really important.
Naomi, as well, we don't know the history. And I know that history is contentious, and history can be used in many ways. People cherry pick history to make points. But we don't know the history, and there's this feeling that the history is separate, maybe from the history we should learn, and it's not. It's all part of our history. We need to expand that in school curricula as well. Was a point on the chat.
Definitely love to see this kind of story, because even like when I went to school, not that long ago, last millennium, but not that long ago, when I was doing history, it was kind of like there was white people history, and then there was like the foreign history, and we didn't think of Elizabethan Britain in terms of having small numbers, but we didn't think of it in terms of like I didn't know about the trade between Queen Elizabeth. We did about the Reformation, but we didn't hear about how Elizabeth I traded with Ottomans and the Persians and the Moroccans. We had just heard about, they fought with Catholic Spain. So there wasn't those kind of, we did about the famine. We didn't talk about, the massive support from the Ottoman Empire. We didn't, talk about, the ethnic minorities who fought in World War I and World War II. Because what we actually see, there's a huge war memorial in London for the animals who died during World War II, I think it was, so the horses and everything, and it's beautiful, lovely monument. There's no monument, or no significant monument, for ethnic minorities and Commonwealth citizens who fought for the Allies. So if you're an animal, and I know my daughter, when she did World War II, she came home and told me all about the animals who fought in World War II, but she knew nothing about the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Palestinians, the Indians, nothing. you know, there was entire, you know, battalions who fought with the French, who fought with the British, who fought, you know, and it just wasn't mentioned at all. And I think that's really sad. And that really needs to change.
Absolutely. Sorry, I couldn't get my button unmuted there. Let me see. I'm just checking the chat here. Yeah. So Asma is saying, my children were taught about the Great Famine, but there was no mention of the Ottoman financial aid being provided by the Ottoman to Ireland during that time. They were quite surprised by the omission.
Yeah, no, because it's quite a big story, and it wasn't just like we do here. I mean, I know there's a monument in Drogheda, so it wasn't just the ships. There was also collections made, and there was collections made among the population of Istanbul. So there was the Sultan he wanted to give more, and Queen Victoria said, no, don't give that much, give less. So he gave less, and the ships came through Drogheda. But there was also collections made by the people of Istanbul. There was a lot of coverage in the media in Istanbul, so that the people were really actually quite informed. It wasn't just like, you know, I'll just send these ships over, because they had, you know, the newspapers of the day. They were really sort of very, you know, these sort of really graphic descriptions of the conditions, and much like we would read about, you know, a famine in, you know, the Ethiopian famine that happened in the 80s and stuff. You know, there's quite graphic descriptions of what was happening in Ireland at that time. So the Turkish population would have been very aware, you know, that the general public would have been very aware of what was happening in Ireland. And you know, so there was more than just a ships. There was an understanding, and there was a concern. And obviously those reports were also in America, and we had the Native Americans give money, and different other groups as well. But, you know, it's just realizing there was a lot more than just a couple of ships. And the Ballycotton Cross, I think that's fascinating. And I think, again, we tend to see Ireland was an island. We forget this is the land of saints and scholars. A lot of our scholars, the Irish scholars that were here, travelled back and forward. There was missionary activity. You know, Patrick himself was supposed to have come from, you know, originally come from, you know, European stock, or possibly Asia. So there was a lot of cross travel that happened from the scholars and the saints, and missionary activity, training. People went to Cordoba, which was the center of learning in Moorish Islamic Spain. They came back with medical knowledge, they came back with science and all this stuff. So a lot of people don't realize there was a lot more sort of ethnic and cultural dialogue than just we all lived in an island and everybody, you know, lived in, there was monks, and then there was, you know, the different tribes, and, you know, we just lived in a bubble. We didn't live in a bubble. And actually there's a straight, you know, sailing route from the south of Ireland straight to Spain, you know, that people would have used. So, you know, just even recognizing that the links went different directions. And the Vikings, of course, they were also in, you know, Moorish Spain and into Andalusia, and, you know, they carried goods and people, as we saw the slaves, but they, you know, they also had trade routes and diplomatic routes as well that were, again, very little explored when it comes to Ireland, but they were there.
Thanks, Naomi. Has anybody else got a question at the moment? I'm just keeping an eye. Jeff?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, Naomi, that's I totally agree with what you said there. As you were going through the slides, it was fascinating, by the way. And I love history. I'm not a historian, but I'm one of those geeks that reads a lot of history, and you know, I just enjoy it. And as you were going through, I was thinking, why didn't I hear about this? Why didn't we learn this in school? You know, and I think you're absolutely right. There needs to be an absolute overhaul in the curriculum that's delivered within the schools across the UK and Ireland. And then the other wee comment, or the question, I suppose, Lisa, you sort of asked a question in the group, and I'm not sure it's been properly discussed yet. And I was looking forward to hearing some ideas around, you know, the use of those terms, you know, BAME. And I know within our own organisation, for the past year to 18 months, there's been an internal conversation across the UK with our BAME colleagues about what could be an alternative to that. You know, what some actually don't want it to change, and other people think actually, you know, we don't like it. Certainly there's a consensus, never use it as a word. It's not a word, you know, BAME. Yeah. So I picked that up. And so there's some suggestions around, you know, global majority and different things. But I'm just wondering, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of alternative suggestions, maybe, or I'm not really sure. Do we need a term? If we agreed we need a term, then what do people think? What should that term be if it's not BAME? What are the conversations that's happening among those communities who are objecting, to those abbreviations? Are there other alternatives coming out, or is the sense that actually we don't need these terms at all? I'm just a little bit. I just need to hear a wee bit more about that.
I think there's so much diversity in that, and maybe I'll get Camilla to speak to that, but I think there's one thing is recognizing there is no BME community.
Yeah,
and recognizing its communities is so important, and recognizing and that's the trouble with BME, it sort of automatically puts everyone in a box. So if you say minority communities, you're recognizing that diversity, you're saying there's different communities, or just individuals. And newcomer community, again, is that sort of idea that people just come in a bubble and they didn't integrate. So they're integrating not only to wider Irish society, but into the existing ethnic minority communities that exist. But Camilla maybe could say something. She's going to speak on that as well.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be covering this in the presentation in the coming weeks.
Okay.
So it'll be interesting to get into a discussion about that. But I'm the same. I don't think there would be a particular term. I don't think there's any consensus at the minute as to how people want to be described. Or, I mean, for myself, I'm mixed ethnicity. I'm from do you know what? I'm actually going to give a lot into the next presentation, so it might actually be good if we're actually going to cover this in the next one. I'll leave that as a suspense.
Sorry, I
in case you don't come. In case you don't come for the next one.
Yeah, come on here, Camilla. She's brilliant as well.
Fantastic. Oh, Camilla, you are brilliant. Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to cover in these 5 weeks, and Naomi's kicked us off to a fantastic start. Definitely. If you have any other questions, we can take a quick question before we wrap up. But Naomi, is there anything else you want to add?
Just I'm available if anybody wants to go take this further. I'm gonna just say, like, I love to get this out to the wider community. I would love more people to know this stuff. I would love this research to be expanded. Like I said, I'm doing a PhD myself, but don't steal my research, credit me, but do please get in touch if you want to take this further, because I would love to see more of this, and just to move away. I said, it's such a contested space, but this is just not even on the radar to a lot of people, and I really would love to see that change. So I am happy to work with anyone who can help that happen. So.
Naomi, I'm trying to find your email contact in the university, and I can't see it because you're not on the staff list, obviously.
It's green. So I've put it down here. It's green n2 at Hotmail. At ulster.ac.hotmail. So I was going to send my other one. So that's it there. I also have personal email. I answered to both, but if you're trying to get me on the university system, it's green at n2.
Thank you. Sorry.
I work with 2 surnames that confuse people. So if anyone wants to email me, they can either, if they don't get that down, get me through Lisa, or email me on either of those. I'll get back to you.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up, folks. Thanks so much for coming today, and we will see you at the next talk as well. Naomi, you're going to be presenting and facilitating the next session as well.
You'll be sick of me by the end of this.
Do you want to give folks a wee flavour of what that's about? So
next session, I'm going to talk a little bit about Islam as a religion. We're going to talk a little bit about an outline, again, sort of recognising the diversity within the Muslim faith, but we want to give like a broad outline, and particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, because I'm just aware of you a lot of working with minority communities. I want to touch on things like Islamic marriage and different things that you may have encountered through your work, that may cause a bit of confusion. And there's things that people say are Islamic and they're not. So we want to talk about FGM, owner-based violence, and that sort of stuff. And then Camilla in the religious context and how it's not Islamic. And Camilla is also going to invite, she's going to interview some people from different backgrounds, and we're going to talk about the cultural aspect as well. And so it's going to be a really interesting session. We've got some great guests coming, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, particularly because it means my part will be finished and then I just get to enjoy the rest. But I do think it'll be a great session. I really look forward to you hopefully all coming back for that as well.
Thank you, Naomi. Thanks very much. And folks, this talk will be on the NI Archive website as well. So please do share it among friends and in your networks, and we'll see you at the next talk. Thanks a million, Naomi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
And don't forget to stop the recording.
Bye.
Now.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.